Let me tell you about an old rancher who walked into a small diner on a cold October morning in 1981, asked for a cup of coffee and a bowl of chili, and was told by the owner that her establishment did not serve men who came in wearing mended overalls. By 6:30 that same evening, when the sun finally dropped behind the Wind River Range and the streetlights along Flaming Gorge Way flickered on one by one, that same old rancher in those same mended overalls owned the building she was standing in. He owned the floor under her boots. He owned the booths she had refused to seat him in. He owned the chrome counter, the coffee pot, the cash register, and the painted sign hanging over the front door, and he had not raised his voice one time the entire day. His name was Caswell Drennan. Most folks who had known him long enough to earn the privilege called him Cass. He was 73 years old that autumn. He ran the Bar D Ranch out on a stretch of high desert and sage flats about 11 miles north of Green River, Wyoming, in Sweetwater County. He had been running it alone since the spring of 1977, which was the spring his wife, Lorena, died of a stroke at the kitchen table with a sewing basket in her lap and a half-mended pair of overalls draped across her knees. Those were the overalls he was wearing the morning he walked into the Sundown Café. She had finished one knee patch and started on the second when her hands stopped moving. He had taken them home from the funeral home along with her wedding ring and her glasses, and he had sat down at that same kitchen table and finished the second patch himself, stitch by stitch, because she had asked him to before she left for that morning, and Cass Drennan was a man who finished what his wife asked him to finish, even after she was gone. That was the kind of man he was. So when he put those overalls on the morning of Thursday, October the 8th, 1981, it was not because he could not afford new ones. He could have bought every pair of overalls in every dry goods store in Sweetwater and Uinta and Lincoln counties combined and not noticed the dent in his bank account. He wore them because Lorena had patched them. He wore them because the second patch on the left knee was the last thing her hands had touched in this world. He had worn those overalls one day a week for 4.5 years, and he intended to keep wearing them one day a week until the cloth finally gave out and the patches no longer held. Now, you need to understand a few things before we get to the diner. You need to understand who Cass Drennan was on paper, and you need to understand who he was in the eyes of the woman behind the counter at the Sundown Café, because those were two very different men, and the gap between them was the whole story. On paper, Cass Drennan owned 23,400 acres of grazing land on the high desert north and east of Green River. He owned 640 head of breeding stock, mother cows of Hereford, and Black Angus, mixed blood. And he leased winter pasture on another 9,000 acres down toward Rock Springs. He owned 3 deep wells on his place, each drilled past 500 feet into good water. He owned a hay operation up against the river that put up about 1,100 tons of alfalfa a season. And on the morning of October the 8th, 1981, the morning we are talking about, Cass Drennan also owned the mineral rights under a section of his ground that had been leased 18 months earlier to Wexpro Energy. And the first quarterly royalty check from that lease had arrived in his mailbox on Tuesday, October the 6th. He had walked it down to Walter Strang at First National Bank of Sweetwater County the next morning, and he had deposited it on Wednesday. The check was for $1,412,600 and 41 cents. That was what Cass Drennan looked like on paper. In the eyes of Adelaide Crowfoot, who at 42 years old owned and operated the Sundown Café on the corner of Flaming Gorge Way and 2nd Street in downtown Green River, Cass Drennan looked like something else entirely to her when the bell over the front door rang at 11:55 that morning and she looked up from the cash register to see who had come in. Cass Drennan looked like an old man in dirty overalls with mud on his boots and white whiskers on his chin and a worn-out canvas coat that had clearly been outdoors more often than indoors. She did not see 23,000 acres. She did not see 600 head of cattle. She did not see a Wexpro royalty check. She did not see Lorena Drennan's patient hands on the second knee patch. She saw a man she had decided she did not want sitting at one of her booths. And that, friends, was the mistake. That was the moment, right there. The moment Adelaide Crowfoot decided she was not going to seat the old man in the mended overalls. That was the hinge of the whole day. Because Adelaide Crowfoot did not know, could not have known, would not believe it if you told her, that the old man standing in her doorway in the dirty boots and the patched overalls was the man who had loaned her late father $54,000 in the spring of 1974 to renovate that very building. She did not know that the balloon payment on that loan was due in her lawyer's office at 5 o'clock that very afternoon. She did not know that her father had missed every monthly payment since June and had ignored 3 certified notices from First National Bank. She did not know any of it. Adelaide Crowfoot looked across her diner at Cass Drennan and saw a beggar. She did not see her landlord. She came out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked halfway down the aisle between the booths, and she said, in a voice loud enough that the 4 other customers in the diner turned to look, "I'm sorry, sir, but we are full up at the moment. You will have to try Earl's down on Bridger Avenue." The diner was not full. It was 11:55 on a Thursday in Green River, Wyoming, in October, and there were maybe 6 people sitting in a room that could seat 50. 2 truckers in the booth by the window, a young woman with a small child in the corner, an old fellow in a wool jacket, reading the Casper newspaper at the counter. That was it. There were 11 empty booths and a whole row of empty counter stools. The diner was not full. Cass Drennan looked at the booths. He looked at Adelaide Crowfoot. He looked down at himself, at the canvas coat and the patched overalls and the mud on his boots from the corral that morning. Then he looked back at Adelaide Crowfoot, and he did not say a word. He just looked at her for maybe 4 or 5 seconds, long enough that she had to look away. Then he tipped his hat to her, polite as you please, the way Lorena had taught him to tip his hat to a woman whose hospitality he was leaving. And he turned around, and he walked out of the Sundown Café. The bell over the door rang behind him. The young woman in the corner went back to feeding her child. The old fellow at the counter went back to his newspaper. The 2 truckers shook their heads at each other and went back to their meatloaf. And Adelaide Crowfoot walked back behind the counter, feeling, by her own admission later, a little flush of satisfaction at having kept her diner the kind of place she wanted it to be. She had no idea what she had just done. Cass Drennan stood out on the sidewalk in the cold October sunshine for a long moment. He pulled his coat collar up against the wind coming down off Wilkins Peak. He looked across the street at the First National Bank of Sweetwater County, the squat brick building with the gold lettering on the front window. And then he walked across Flaming Gorge Way, against the light, and he pushed open the bank door, and he asked the receptionist if Walter Strang was in his office. Walter Strang was 58 years old that fall. He had been the senior loan officer at First National for 19 years, and the president for 6, and he had known Caswell Drennan for the entire time. He had also known Lorena, and he had carried one corner of her casket at the funeral in 1977. When his secretary told him Mr. Drennan was in the lobby, asking to see him, Walter Strang did not say, "Send him in," or "What does he want?" He stood up from behind his desk and walked out to the lobby himself. And he shook Cass's hand, and he asked him how the heifers were wintering and how the new well over by Big Sandy was producing. They walked back to his office together. Walter Strang shut the door behind them. Cass sat down. He did not take off his coat. He set his hat on his knee, and he looked at Walter Strang across the desk, and he said, "Walter, I need to ask you a question about the note I'm carrying on Hank Crowfoot's daughter's diner." Now I need to back up here, friends, because you have to understand this part. In the spring of 1974, Adelaide Crowfoot's father, a man named Hank Crowfoot, had owned the building that now housed the Sundown Café. He had owned it free and clear since 1961. But the building was old, and the wiring was bad, and the roof was leaking, and Hank had wanted to renovate. He wanted to put in new booths, new kitchen equipment, a new walk-in cooler, new tile, new fixtures, new electrical, new everything. The whole renovation was going to cost about $54,000, which in 1974 was real money, and Hank Crowfoot did not have it. He went to 2 banks in Green River, and they both turned him down on account of his age and his shaky cash flow. So Hank Crowfoot did what a lot of folks in Sweetwater County did when the banks said no. He went to Caswell Drennan. Cass had known Hank for 30 years. They were not close friends, but they were friendly enough, the way men who have worked the same county for a long time tend to be friendly. Hank came out to the Bar D Ranch on a Sunday afternoon in May of 1974, and he sat at Cass and Lorena's kitchen table, and he laid out what he needed. Cass listened. He did not say much. When Hank was done, Cass said he would loan him the $54,000 at 6.5% interest, on the standard terms his lawyer, Theron Marsh, always wrote up for him. Monthly payments, a 7-year amortization, with a balloon for the remaining balance due at the end of the 7th year. They shook hands. Theron Marsh drew up the note and the trust deed the next week. Hank Crowfoot signed it in Theron's office on June the 3rd, 1974, with the diner building put up as the collateral. The balloon payment was scheduled for 5 p.m. on October the 8th, 1981, which happened to be the 7th anniversary of the renovation finishing. Hank Crowfoot made his payments every month for the first 3 years, like clockwork. Then Hank died of a heart attack in the kitchen of the Sundown Café in November of 1976. He left the building and the note in the diner to his daughter Adelaide, who at 37 years old was a divorced waitress from Rock Springs and who had come home to take over the family business. Adelaide had inherited a lot of things from her father, including his stubbornness and his temper, but she had not inherited his understanding of how money worked. She had kept the diner running. She had even made it modestly profitable. But the loan payments to Caswell Drennan were just a number on a paper, and over the years that number had become something she resented. She did not know Cass. She had never met him. To her, he was just an old man on a ranch somewhere who was taking $320 out of her pocket every month. She had missed the August payment. Walter Strang, who was the custodian of the note on Cass's behalf, and who handled the monthly collection, had sent her a notice. She had ignored it. She had missed the September payment. Walter Strang had sent her a second notice, this time certified mail, return receipt requested. She had signed for it and ignored it. He had sent her a third notice in late September, reminding her that the balloon payment of $9,210 was due in his office at 5 p.m. on October the 8th, 1981, and that under the terms of the trust deed, failure to make the balloon payment would result in substitute trustees' deed proceedings under Wyoming statute. She had read that letter standing at her cash register on the morning of September the 29th, and she had crumpled it up and dropped it in the wastebasket without finishing it. She thought Walter Strang was bluffing. She thought the old rancher who held her note was probably half dead anyway, and would never actually foreclose on a small-town diner. She figured she had time. That was the second mistake of her day. Although she did not yet know it, the first mistake had been refusing to seat Cass Drennan 20 minutes earlier. Cass sat in Walter Strang's office, and he asked his question plain. "Walter, has Miss Crowfoot made the balloon payment on her father's note?" Walter Strang did not have to look at the file. He shook his head. "She has not, Cass. She missed August. She missed September. She has not responded to 3 notices. The balloon is due at 5 o'clock today, and I have no reason to believe she's going to pay it. I was planning to call you this evening to discuss next steps." Cass nodded slowly. He looked down at his hat on his knee. He looked at the patches on his overalls. He looked back up at Walter Strang and he said, "Walter, I just came across the street from her diner. I went in for a bowl of chili and a cup of coffee. She would not seat me. She told me to try Earl's down on Bridger." Walter Strang did not say anything for a moment. He was a banker. He understood, the way a banker understands these things, what had just been set in motion. Finally he said very quietly, "Cass, what would you like to do?" Cass said, "Walter, I would like to talk to Theron Marsh. Could you ask him to come over?" Theron Marsh was Cass's lawyer. He had been Cass's lawyer for 31 years. His office was 3 doors down from the bank on 2nd Street. Walter Strang called him on the phone, and Theron walked over in his shirt sleeves with a folder under his arm. He came into Walter's office, and he shook Cass's hand, and he sat down, and Walter explained, in 3 sentences, what had happened. Theron Marsh did not smile, but if you had watched his eyes carefully, you would have seen something tighten and then settle. He had drawn up the original note in 1974. He had drawn up every notice that had gone out to Adelaide Crowfoot since June. He had been ready for this moment for 60 days. "Cass," Theron said, "if you give me the word, I can have a substitute trustee's deed prepared by 4:30 this afternoon. We can record it with the county clerk before they close at 5. Wyoming statute on non-judicial foreclosure of a trust deed is clean. The notices have all been served and documented. The balloon comes due at 5 p.m. today. If she does not appear in Walter's office at 5 p.m., with a cashier's check for $9,210, the property reverts under the terms of the trust deed. You become the owner of the building free and clear at 5:01 p.m. Cass nodded once. He stood up. He put his hat on. He shook Walter Strang's hand, and he shook Theron Marsh's hand. I am going to walk down to the feed store and talk to Jericho about the heifers, he said. I will be back here at 4:45. He walked out of the bank. The wind had picked up. He pulled his collar up. He walked 4 blocks south to the feed store on Bridger Avenue, where his foreman, Jericho Pegg, was loading 300 pounds of supplement into the bed of the ranch truck. Jericho was 46 years old and had worked for Cass for 22 years. Cass did not tell him about the diner. He did not tell him about the note. He just helped him finish loading the supplement, and then they walked across the street to Earl's, where Cass ordered a bowl of chili and a cup of coffee and a slice of cherry pie. And he ate his lunch in a booth by the window and looked out at the cold sunshine on Bridger Avenue. And he did not say much of anything. Jericho, who knew his boss well enough to know when not to ask questions, ate his lunch quietly across the table. At 4:15, Cass paid the check at Earl's, left a $1 tip on the table, and walked back up to First National Bank. Theron Marsh was already in Walter Strang's office. There were 3 documents laid out on the desk. The substitute trustee's deed, transferring ownership of the diner building from Adelaide Crowfoot to Caswell Drennan. An affidavit of default attesting to the missed payments and the unanswered notices, and a notice of completed foreclosure to be filed with the Sweetwater County clerk's office that afternoon. Cass read each document carefully. He had not made it past the 4th grade as far as formal schooling went, but Lorena had taught him to read every line of every legal paper that ever came across his table, and he had not signed anything in 50 years without reading it twice. He read these 3 twice, then he signed each one. Walter Strang notarized his signature. Theron Marsh folded the deed and the affidavit into his folder and stood up. I will walk these over to the county clerk now, Theron said. I will be back before 5. He walked out. Cass and Walter Strang sat in silence for 35 minutes. The wall clock above Walter's filing cabinet ticked steadily through the quiet. At 4:58, Theron Marsh came back into the office with the receipt from the county clerk. The substitute trustee's deed had been recorded at 4:52 p.m. Volume 487, page 211 of the Sweetwater County Land Records. The diner building belonged to Caswell Drennan as of that moment. At 5 o'clock, the door of Walter Strang's lobby did not open. Adelaide Crowfoot did not appear with a cashier's check. She did not call. She did not send a representative. 5 o'clock came and went. At 5:01, Walter Strang quietly noted the time on the affidavit of default. At 5:02, the legal transfer was complete and recorded. The Sundown Café still existed, but the building it sat in no longer belonged to the woman behind the counter. Cass Drennan stood up. He put his hat back on. He thanked Walter Strang. He thanked Theron Marsh. He took the certified copy of the deed that Theron handed him, folded it neatly into thirds, and put it in the inside pocket of his canvas coat. Then he walked out of the bank into the cold blue October dusk, and he crossed Flaming Gorge Way for the 2nd time that day. The bell over the door of the Sundown Café rang at 5:28 p.m. as he pushed his way inside. Adelaide Crowfoot was at the cash register again. The dinner crowd had not yet started to come in. There were 3 customers in the room. She looked up when the bell rang and she saw the same old man in the same mended overalls, and she felt something cold drop in her stomach. He should not have come back. She had told him to go to Earl's. She opened her mouth to repeat herself, more sharply this time, but Caswell Drennan was already walking down the aisle between the booths toward her. He did not stop. He walked all the way up to the cash register, and he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat, and he took out the folded certified copy of the substitute trustee's deed, and he laid it on the counter in front of her. He smoothed it flat with the back of his hand. "Miss Crowfoot," he said, in the same quiet voice he had used to tip his hat to her at 11:55 that morning, "I do not believe we have been properly introduced. My name is Caswell Drennan. I have been the holder of the note on this building since June of 1974. The balloon payment came due at 5 o'clock this afternoon. You did not appear. The property has reverted to me under the terms of the trust deed your father signed. I came across the street earlier today to have a bowl of chili and a cup of coffee in your diner, and you told me to go elsewhere. I am back now because I would like to discuss what happens next." Adelaide Crowfoot looked at the deed on the counter. She picked it up with hands that were shaking. She read the first page. She read the second page. She read the county clerk's stamp on the back. She set the document down on the counter, and she put both palms flat on the counter to steady herself. She did not say anything. There was nothing she could say. The three customers in the diner had stopped pretending not to listen. Caswell Drennan looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the deed and folded it back into thirds and put it back in his coat pocket. He looked around the diner. He looked at the booths and the counter and the chrome fixtures and the painted sign over the back wall. He looked at the framed photograph of Hank Crowfoot that hung behind the register. He looked back at Adelaide. "Miss Crowfoot," he said, "I knew your daddy. He was a fair man. He was a hard man, but he was a fair man, and he honored his obligations as best he could. I am going to do something now that I would like you to remember. I am going to give you 12 months in this building, rent-free, starting tomorrow morning. 12 months for you to find a new location, or to come up with an offer to buy the building back from me at a fair price, or to make whatever arrangements you need to make. 12 months. I will have Theron Marsh draw up the lease tomorrow. You will not pay $1 in rent for those 12 months. I do not need the money. I have more money than I know what to do with, and I do not require any of yours." He paused. He looked at her hard. "But I want you to do one thing for me, Miss Crowfoot. I want you to write this down somewhere and hang it where you will see it every morning. The next time an old man in mended overalls walks into a diner, you are running. Anywhere, ever. You are going to seat him. You are going to bring him coffee. You are going to ask him what he wants to eat. And if he wants a bowl of chili, you are going to bring him a bowl of chili. And you are going to thank him for his business when he leaves. Because you cannot tell, Miss Crowfoot. You cannot ever tell. You cannot tell from the patches on a man's knees what he carries in his coat pocket. You cannot tell from the mud on his boots what kind of ground he owns. You cannot tell from the white in his whiskers how many years he has been keeping a promise his wife asked him to keep. You cannot tell. And the day you forget that, the day you decide you can tell, is the day you lose something you should not have lost. He tipped his hat to her. The same polite tip of the hat he had given her at 11:55 that morning. Then he turned around and he walked out of the Sundown Café. The bell rang behind him. The three customers stared. Adelaide Crowfoot stood at the cash register, with both palms flat on the counter and tears running down her face, and she did not move for a long time. Cass Drennan walked across the street to his pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat. He sat there for a moment, looking out through the windshield at the gold lettering on the bank window across the street. The sun had just dropped behind the Wind River Range to the west. The streetlights along Flaming Gorge Way flickered on, one by one. The clock on the bank tower said 6:32 p.m., sundown. He had owned the building since 5:02, but the sun had only just now set on the day. Owned the building by sundown. He thought about that for a moment, and he did not smile. But the corner of his mouth moved a little. He drove home to the Bar D Ranch. It was a 40-minute drive on the dirt section road, with the headlights cutting through the dust and the sage. He pulled into the yard a little after 7. The kitchen light was on, because Jericho had stopped by and turned it on for him, the way Jericho always did when his boss had been in town all day. Cass walked up the steps. He took off his hat in the mudroom. He took off his canvas coat. He hung them both on the pegs Lorena had nailed into the wall in 1953. He walked into the kitchen, and he stood at the counter for a moment, looking out the window over the sink at the dark. Then he took down 2 coffee cups from the cabinet above the sink. He poured fresh coffee into both of them from the pot Jericho had left on the stove. He set 1 cup at his place at the kitchen table. He set the other cup at the place across from his, where Lorena had always sat. He sat down. He picked up his cup. He looked at the cup across from him, and he looked at the empty chair behind it, and he said out loud to the empty kitchen, "I had a strange day in town, Lorena. I thought you would want to hear about it." And then he told her, from start to finish. He told her about the bell over the door at the Sundown Café and the booth sitting empty and Adelaide Crowfoot in her apron. He told her about Walter Strang and Theron Marsh and the substitute trustee's deed. He told her about coming back at 5:30 and laying the paper on the counter and giving the woman 12 months rent-free. He told her every word he had said about the patches on his overalls and the mud on his boots and how you cannot ever tell. He talked for almost an hour. When he was done, he drank his coffee. The cup across the table sat untouched, the way it had sat untouched every evening for 4.5 years. He picked up both cups when he was done, and he washed them, and he set them upside down on the drying rack, the way Lorena had always set them. Then he went to bed. The story of what happened at the Sundown Café that afternoon rippled through Green River, Wyoming, the next day. The 3 customers who had been in the diner at 5:30 told their wives. Their wives told the neighbors. The neighbors told the feed store. By Saturday morning, the whole county knew. Adelaide Crowfoot did exactly what Cass Drennan had asked her to do. She wrote out his words on a piece of butcher paper, and she taped it above the cash register at the Sundown Café, where it stayed for the next 12 months and for 14 years after that. Even when the diner moved across town to a new location on Uinta Drive. She seated every old man who walked through her door, in mended overalls or not, and she brought them coffee and a bowl of chili if they asked for it. 11 months later, Adelaide Crowfoot drove out to the Bar D Ranch on a Sunday afternoon in September of 1982, with a check for $46,000 in her purse, which was a fair price for the building, given the depreciated value of a small-town diner in a cooling oil patch economy. She knocked on Cass Drennan's kitchen door. He invited her in. He poured her a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. They sat across from each other, and they talked for 2 hours. And at the end of it, Adelaide Crowfoot owned the Sundown Café building, free and clear, once again. And Cass Drennan had a check in his pocket that he did not need, and a story he could tell Lorena that evening over 2 coffee cups at the kitchen table. He told Lorena about it that night. He told her Adelaide had cried again, sitting across from him, when she said she was sorry. He told her Adelaide had asked before she left, what kind of man wears a pair of overalls his wife patched on the morning she died, every Thursday, 4.5 years later? He told her he did not know how to answer that question, so he had just looked at her and said, the kind that finishes what she asked him to finish. He told her Adelaide had cried harder at that. He told her she had driven away in the cold autumn sunshine. And then Cass Drennan, in the empty kitchen of the Bar D Ranch, 11 miles north of Green River, Wyoming, raised his coffee cup to the empty chair across the table from him, and he said, I think she will be all right, Lorena. I think she learned what she needed to learn. And that, friends, that is the story. That is the story of the old rancher who walked into a diner in his mended overalls on a cold October morning in 1981, and who owned the building by sundown, and who never raised his voice one time the entire day, and who went home and told the empty chair across from him at his own kitchen table everything that had happened, because that was the kind of man he was. That was the kind of marriage he had had, and that was the lesson Adelaide Crowfoot wrote out on butcher paper and taped above her cash register, the lesson she carried with her for the rest of her life. The lesson I would like you to carry with you when you walk out of your own door tomorrow morning. You cannot tell, friends. You cannot ever tell. From the patches on a man's knees, from the mud on his boots, from the white in his whiskers, from the quiet way he tips his hat to a woman who has just turned him away. You cannot tell what that man owns. You cannot tell what he has loved. You cannot tell what he has lost. You cannot tell what he has finished, stitch by stitch, in the long, quiet years of a kitchen that is quieter than it used to be. So when an old man in mended overalls walks into your diner, your store, your office, your church, your life, you seat him, friends. You bring him coffee. You ask him what he wants. And you thank him for his business when he leaves, because that is the only way you will ever learn what kind of man he really is.